This episode is brought to you by Snapple. Want to know another Snapple fact? The first hot air balloon passengers were a sheep, a duck, and a rooster. Ridiculous. Check out Snapple.com to find ridiculously flavored Snapple near you.
Okay, so I have to say that I'm doing this. These topics we're going to cover aren't going to be like the best topics. Some of these topics are really going to be... Some of these topics are going to be very controversial. And I think today's topic might be a bit controversial, but only because I don't quite understand. Like, I understand both sides, but I don't understand this idea. Right, and it's weird because this culture this thing only happens in like in American societies, but it's a weird thing to hold, and so I'm gonna be completely honest. I think music is more about the experiences that people live through, right? For people relate to certain music, it's because it's certainly what people relate to. It's not necessarily that, one whole culture experiences this, so this is what it has to be, right? And so, with that being said, though, I also have to look at some of the privileges I have been given, right? So this is going to be an argument where I'm going to try to argue in good faith, but at the same time, it's weird because if you translate this conversation to other topics, then these other topics have other lead on points, other discussions that we can talk about that hip hop in itself or rap in itself don't quite make sense to me. And so when I express this, I don't mean any harm. I don't mean to offend anybody, and I just don't mean to make anybody angry from the remarks I'm going to make. And I know not everyone's going to agree with me, so I get that. And I know there's some people that be like, okay, well, but this is also it's the thing of we've seen this happen. Y'all don't care, and then we come back to this conversation where it might seem like I don't care. Or it might seem that I'm arguing in good faith, and it might not be necessarily good faith, but I'm going to call myself out on it. But for this discussion, there are going to be parts. So for this first part of this discussion, I'm going to have this conversation by myself. Second conversation, I'm gonna bring a guest on. We're going to have another conversation about this discussion, and we're going to see if we can agree to disagree. And then this other part of this series, I plan on making this a 4-part series, but when I make this a 4-part series, there's going to be a discussion that I'm going to enjoy having, right? Like, this conversation, this discussion is something I'm going to enjoy having. It's going to be me being a lot more creative, where in aspects where I want to be creative, but it also will bring people to this discussion. And you'll see people's live reaction to this discussion, which I'm hoping to do more this year. It's going to have more conversations with people, have more discussions, have more interviews. That's things that I'm willing to do this year. But we're going to talk about hip hop. We're going to talk about hip hop, and we're also going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about hip hop, but we're going to talk about race and kind of hip hop, or how we understand hip hop. We're going to talk about this because I don't necessarily understand this. So I'm going to take 2 points, but they're going to be 2 points that you can't argue them in good faith. I think this is the thing, where people are saying that anybody from a certain culture, or people that don't associate with American culture, can be a part of hip hop. As we've seen in the Drake thing, people saying that he's not part of the culture and he doesn't understand African American culture. Oh, I don't know if he's saying. I don't know. This is the thing. I don't know if this is also a debate. Like, it's a weird thing because people will hold on to colorism and people will go, oh, well, if they're not this, then they're not this, and it's not all about this. But hip hop in general is meant for people to express themselves, express through their experiences, but express through themselves. And so it's difficult for me to go in good faith and go, okay, because so-and-so isn't this. And we've seen it with Rick Ross when he called Drake the white boy. We've seen this when people say that, oh, he's not part of the culture. We've seen this when Drake necessarily became rising in hip hop, when people were like, he doesn't necessarily fit in Toronto. Or the conversation in Toronto was that Drake doesn't necessarily, or Drake said it himself, so I'll put it the way Drake said it. Drake said that he was too dark for Toronto, but he's not dark enough for America. Right? And it's weird to me because you'll say, okay, this is the case, and Eminem's another prime case in hip hop, where people will go, okay, because they're not this, they're not this. Right? They're not this and they're not this, so then therefore they can't speak on the experience of people in hip hop. But if the concept of hip hop is to go and say, no, you know what, I'll do it like this. If the culture of hip hop is the idea that people are of a certain race are supposed to gatekeep a culture and things like that, why does no one sample Miles Davis? And people say, well, they're not this, so they shouldn't get the popularity. Wale also said the same thing. Right? We've had people have this conversation of, oh, they don't fit this shade color, so they're not getting promotion. Right? And that wasn't that was, like, if you look at hip-hop, that might be an attack on Chris Brown, that might be an attack on Drake. And I'm not trying to discredit anybody, but we have this conversation of, okay, well, he's not dark enough to be, or he's not dark enough, or he's not from the roots, that he can't be he can't be the greatest of all time. So my question is this. So my overall question is this. If the greatest of all times has to be from African descent, does that disqualify African Americans? Or does that disqualify blacks? It's weird to me because this distinction of, and so I'll have this with a bunch of people where they'll go, I prefer to be Jamaican American, or I prefer to be African American, because they have descendants and they have roots from Africa, but they're part of American culture, right? But then you have some people that say, I prefer black, and it's because of this, X, Y, and Z. So my question is, if you're saying that a person can't be, or cannot be the greatest of all time because they don't have African descent, does that mean people that classify themselves as black, or people classify themselves as strictly American, cannot be labeled the greatest of all times? Because if that is the case, if that's strictly the case, and that we bring Kendrick's point, they're not part of the culture, they're not like us. My question then is, if they don't share the same skin tone as somebody that is more African based, but in Africa there are people that are lighter skin tones, we can argue that through history, this is through different trades and different things that Europeans did. We can argue that all day. We can argue that every other day. But if we're going to sit here and say, because they don't have descendants, or they aren't descendants from people from Africa or tribes in Africa, then therefore they don't own that crown, they can't be the greatest of times, then we have to check. We have to check Biggie. We have to check Jay-Z. We have to check KRS-One, right? We have to talk. We have to have a genuine conversation. Or are we going by skin tone alone? Because if we're going by skin tone alone, that doesn't make you great. Just because your skin tone means you have a qualification that a lot of artists won't be able to get because they don't have that qualification, so their rhyme schemes won't matter. Their rhyme schemes don't matter. Their lyricism does not matter. Right? And if that's solely the conversation, then what does that say about sociology? What does that say about psychology, where the minority in that group are women in early psychology and African Americans or black Americans? Where does that lead us? Just because we're in their fields, we can't be the best? Well, that's disqualification. And that we can argue that's discrimination. we can argue at a certain point that they can never be great because they're in this field. For example, the Clarks are amazing at what they do, but they're not disqualified in psychology. W.E. Du Bois wrote The Black Folks, wrote amazing books, but because of his skin tone, he should be disqualified as one of the greatest. So my question is, if the penmanship, if experience isn't the thing that we're like, okay, we're gonna judge based on experience, then let's look at who has descendants from African Americans or African roots, and everyone that doesn't have African roots can be the greatest of all times. But do you see how that number gets smaller, smaller, and smaller, and smaller? That's fine. And people will go and argue that, and in good faith, and I mean, it's somewhat good faith, that Eminem doesn't deserve to be the greatest of all time. But lyrically, he can rap. We've seen a story. And if you want to go the extra mile, 8 Miles, Eminem is a battleground rapper before he became famous. But most people will discredit that and go, well, he can't be because of this, X, Y, and Z. But if somebody's gonna label him the greatest of all times, they should be able to, right? Because his penmanship, his experience, and if you want to go 8 Miles, a bunch of statements that coming out of 8 Miles that people said that they were just there. They had a rapping competition, and whoever won, the top 3 would get to face Eminem in 8 Miles. So as we take it, those are great. Those were rap battles. So my question is, does the music not matter? The skin tone officially decides what matters. Because I can argue Eminem's The Marshall Mathers EP is a classic. But the argument will be Eminem doesn't have a classic. And the reason he doesn't have a classic is because people don't like the skin tone of Eminem. Which is weird because then you're not looking at the art. Because we've had 50, we have Snoop Dogg, we've had Dr. Dre say Eminem was great. But when you ask people that are too deep into hip-hop, oh, they can never be great because they're not this. Or Drake can be part of the culture because of who he decided to have a child with. Or the way he promotes, how he promotes in people's communities, which sounds weird to me because if you look at that, Drake does stuff that Future does, and Future does the same thing that Drake does, right? And so that leads me to this conversation of what do we do with Cole, right? Because by that same logic, he has 2 parents, right? And his mother and his parents are, we can get into that if we need to in a second discussion, but it's the thing of, if you look at where J. Cole is actually born, or the country he's born in, not America. So then he has a bunch of different roots because he was born in American, I think it was an American base. And what does that say about children that are born in base? Because the conversation is, oh, well, we don't, if somebody was as lyrical as Eminem, and they were this, they would have a hard time. No. That's not necessarily the case. It's the case that it's the case that hip hop overlooks people that are as lyrical as Eminem because they're not. Because of what? Because I mean, if that is the case, if that's truly the case, in good faith, if that is the argument that people are gonna make, then Black Thought, KRS-One, Jay-Z, Method Man, Dave, Stormy, on the American side alone, should have amazing people. But what we don't see in the UK, we don't see the same thing for hip hop. We see Stormy, we see Daves, we see Lil Sims, but we also see so many people like Central C, right? We see people that are rapping and they're doing the thing that they have done because of their experiences in hip hop. Now, if you want to argue the reason we're doing this is because of racism, then that's fine, but you have to understand that if they don't have African descent, then they can never be the greatest of all time. However, we've never checked anybody for being the greatest of all time having to be African descent, right? And we've seen it in We've seen it in Kane's interview. He says, like, and he said it during the beef, but he also said that if you're looking for evidence or proof and truth, that's not how we've done it. We've always done it who spits it the best. And 9 times out of 10, when Eminem's on the track, he spits it the best. Right? Like 8 out of 9 10 8 out of 10 times he spits it the best. Right? But if we go on this evolution of, oh, well, he can't do that, look at D12. People have argued that Eminem didn't put enough effort behind D12. But D12 had Killer Croc. King Croc, I'm sorry. Royce da 5'9". Had a lot of interesting people that could rap, right? And we're like, they're not like not killed. Like, we've had rappers that have battle rap that are amazing at what they do. But if we start going, oh, they're disqualified because they're not African descent, then where's hip hop? Where's hip hop? Because hip hop doesn't just sample Afro music. It doesn't do Afro beats. A lot of them don't sample Afro beats, but Afro beats is a great genre of music. Some don't even do dancehall. But to say hip hop, oh, if you're not this, then you can't be this, doesn't it seem hypocritical? Like, cause Elvis did it with rock, and y'all are mad about that. But if we exclude the same people that are mad because Elvis did that, aren't we just the same people just years later doing the same thing? And so by that same comparison, we aren't giving artists that can lyrically rap the chance to show that they can be the greatest of all times. Right? Because if we do that same thing in music, we do it in pop. Michael Jackson can never be the king of pop. We could argue skin condition, and then we could argue this. We have a list of things that we could argue. But by that same metric, we're measuring everything but African roots. So, with that being said, like, then where is hip hop? Because we have Miles Davis, right? We have a lot of amazing trumpetists. We have amazing people that are poets. We have amazing people that are sociologists. We have a lot of people that are psychologists. But when they're written on paper, they get the same notoriety. And so I take that with a privilege because I do like psychology and I love sociology. I also love music, right? So it's weird to me that we're having this conversation of, oh, well, if they're not African descent, then they can't be considered hip-hop. But I'm questioning why. Right? Because anybody should be able to make music if it's based off their own experience. And it's weird to me. It's weird to me to have this conversation because I've been trying to figure out a nice way to put this for years. I've been trying to find a nice way to put this. But for people to say, oh, well, he can't do this because he'll never be the greatest of all time, why not? If we strictly look at the lyrics, the lyricism, the double entendres, the metaphors, we do everything the way we're supposed to guide it, why can't we? In theory, if we were doing it right, if hip-hop was doing it right by lyrics by themselves, we'd have to be like Lil Wayne. Like, he sees it, he recognizes it, but at the same time, he's like, you know, some of these guys can rap. Like, it's genuinely true. Some guys can genuinely rap, like Hopkins can rap, right? But we won't give him no credit. Jordan can rap, right? Like, we have people that can rap, but because they're not famous, or because they're not this, they haven't gotten the mainstream. And we can argue, and so this is the thing, we can argue that, okay, the reason Chris Brown is famous is because he was on TVs before then, so that's why he became famous, and then while he became famous, the skin tone just mattered. That's kind of okay. But in bad face would be the Wale conversation of because he's not light enough, he's not by any chance, he's not getting played. Right, but if color is the only thing that's making a difference here, Wale's point is mute. But to be fair, if you look at Wale's catalog, he doesn't have that many classics. But if we're only going to skin tone, Wale should be up there. Right? Because he's had the most features with the most amazing artists. But what we realized is going by skin tone doesn't move a genre of music any forward. by that same logic, people can't sample certain people. Right? And that's crazy to me because we have a bunch of bands that are amazing. But African American or American bands barely get sampled. So my question is, if that is the case, like, this is my question. Like, if we go, it has to be it has to be of African descent. My question is, I've never found, and I could be wrong, but there's little hip hop samples that are from the OJs, from the Four Tops. Even I have not heard a Four Top sample in years. Never heard a sample from the Four Tops. But because we're like, they should be sampled, we overlook a few things. Like Kool and the Gang, they're rarely sampled. And the last time I think they were sampled, like, there's so many. If you want to be that way, fine. Then we can only sample the OJs, the Temptations, the Four Tops. There's so many people. The Jackson 5, the Isley Brothers. I think the Isley Brothers are still alive. It's so many people, and I'm just like, if you are gonna sit here and argue in bad faith that they're supposed to be a certain way, I don't understand it. And I'll never understand that, because by that same logic, and we could argue that some genres gatekeep. We could argue that. But why should hip-hop? If it's based on experience, why should hip-hop? Because I'm not quite understanding that logic of it, right? Because music is supposed to bring people together, not divide people. And I can argue that I listen to a lot of country music. I also listen to a lot of blues. I also listen to a lot of funky. I also listen to a lot of metal. I listen to a lot of people. Like, I do. My genre of music is so broad, right? But at the same time, if y'all are saying that no one can be the greatest of all time because of X, Y, and Z, that doesn't make sense to me. Because a legend and the greatest of all time are closely associated. So if you think, and I was like, you say, as Eminem is a legend, you can argue that by yourself. You can argue that. But the greatest of all time and a legend are so closely associated that if we can't label him the greatest of all time, or of some genre, then we're handicapping ourselves as a genre that can't give anybody credit for the work they put in. Because I think the Marshall Mathers LP is a classic. But because people don't see Eminem as a lyrical artist, we'll never get that. If we want to have a conversation on why Eminem isn't, okay, fine, we can talk about Revival. If Drake isn't, we can talk about that. We can talk about Take Care. We can talk about Allegations. We can talk about that. But the thing is, when it comes to, they haven't lived this dream, so they can't speak on that culture, that's crazy to me. I know a bunch of people that share some kind of descent that's closely related to mine. And they'll say the same thing. Hey, I grew up this way. I didn't necessarily grow up in the ideal slums or the ideal thing, or separation or segregation. And I mean segregation, I'm talking about like the divide, where it's solely one group or something like that. I wasn't like that. I know a few people that's like that. Me, my story's different. I remember growing up in a lot of different ways. But because my experience is a certain way, doesn't mean, everyone I listen to has to be that way. That's just not true. That's not genuine. That's not giving people and their experience credit for what they've done and created masterpieces and stuff like that. I think the Black Album by Jay-Z, great album. But like, this conversation can't be in good faith if we go, we're only doing African descent. Why African descent? That means every time somebody says greatest all the time, okay, cool. Well, we have to draw your blood. We have to check to make sure these match up with this. And that to me is just like a confirmation bias when we go, oh, well, all my artists are from African descent or have at some point decided that they originate from Afro, which is fine, but it's the concept of, then that's a lonely list. That's a lonely list, right? I'll say my top anything listed anything is vague. I mean, there's certain qualities that I pick for certain people, but it's weird to me to go that way because I don't think you can go the Eminem show, encore, this and that, take care, nothing was the same, and if you only look at race, it's weird to me because I can't go. And here's my bias. I can't go, oh, because they're African in origin or they use an Afro beat, it's amazingly going to be great. I can't do that because that would be me putting my biases up front and going, well, I'm keeping my biases inside, so there's artists I'm going to listen to. I mean, now, most of my artists, I will admit, have Nigerian backgrounds, like Tems, Little Sims. A lot of them have origin backgrounds that are Nigerian. But if they weren't Nigerian, I would still listen to them. Stormzy is a great example. Dave is a great example. Sketch is a great example. Hopkins is another great example. Eminem's a great example, right? It's weird. Like, Drake's a great example. Kendrick, J. Cole, they're great examples, right? But the argument is, oh, because they're not this in origin, we can't necessarily agree that they understand the dynamics of people. And that is weird to me too, because they're like, well, if they didn't experience it, they'll never understand the dynamics. And that's fine. We can argue dynamics and say that, okay, sure, right? But studies have proven that, the African American men are at some point are at some point trying to be in a household, and we could argue that, but that's what I'm saying. That goes against stereotype. So it's weird for me to go, hey, they have to be a stereotypical person. They have to follow between these. They have to fall in between these special criteria. If they don't qualify. Because let's be honest, 99. Anybody after 2000, we'll go 2005, 2006. A lot of people don't have Biggie and Pac in their greatest of all time. Do you want to know why? Because a lot of people didn't listen to Pac and Biggie. A lot of people didn't experience that, so they'll never be in their top 5 or greatest of all time. Want to know why? Because they haven't listened to it. Me personally, I have. I know a lot of people that have. I know a lot of people that haven't. Right? But to say everybody must have the greatest of all time, be Pac and Biggie, Nas and Jay. A lot of people, that's not a lot of people's reality. It's not. So to say, okay, they can only be the greatest of all time, and they're only accepted if they have African descent or Afro descent, it sounds like we're keeping something that necessarily doesn't need to be kept. Right? It seems, for a better judgment, it just seems that we're like, hey, whatever I listen to is mine. That's fine. Music's supposed to be subjective. Music, by the board, is extremely subjective. It's never supposed to be the same. Right? It's never going to be, oh, we agree with everyone on everyone that ever picked. That's why when you ask people, they'll go Pac, Biggie, Pac, Biggie, Pac. Is that top 1 or 2? Jay, Nas. It's people are supposed to be picky. People are supposed to have their own decisions that they believe or who's up by the artist. It's never supposed to be, oh, well, I believe this, so everyone must believe this, or everybody must do this. Right? Because some people barely use the 808 anymore. And people just go, oh, well, if it's the 808, then we know it's hip hop. People barely use the 808 anymore. So does that mean we have no hip hop no more? Because people stopped using the 808? Because T-Pain and Kanye got creative? So, these criteria sound... It limits your music choice by a lot. because then you have to DNA test your artists, then they have to do this, then they have to do support certain. Then they have to support certain issues, and if they don't support the issues, then you want to listen to them, and then that takes them out of your top, the greatest of all time for you. Then it can't be legends because X, Y, and Z. It's a lot of work. It really is, and I don't think anybody wants to do that work on those topics like that. Now I could be wrong. People could be like, you know what? I'd do that. I would do that daily. That's what I do for all my artists. I don't. I know a lot of people don't. I listen to whoever I want to. I listen to anybody I want to, right? Because they all have their own experiences. I listen to whoever. That has to. This is unscripted, but that has to be tiring to go, you know what? Let me listen to so and so because they might not be of origin of this, or they might not be this. That has to be tiring, and I don't mean that as, and, you know, it might be a little bit of a negative, but I just can't have that conversation where I'm like, oh, well, this and this. I just can't do it. Now, if you can do it, I do apologize. This probably seems like a rant to you. But I think disqualifying people because we think this doesn't qualify for this, just, it doesn't sound like a good argument to have. I think, I don't know, it's, at this point, I think I'm just rambling on and recycling information. But when Eminem or another artist has like the greatest, I think we should look at the numbers either on Spotify or the artist, or how many listeners an artist gets a month, or over on a year, how much they make in a year. There's something I think we should, but to sit here and say the reason I don't listen to artists because this, it sounds silly to me, because I think this is extremely subjective. I think if you go to me and ask me who do you listen to the most, out of people that recently dropped, I would go J. Cole, Might Delete Later, Party Next Doors, Party Next Door 4, Bryson Tillers, and Little Sims. But I think Sober's going to be in that conversation. But I think the reason it is that way is because Eminem hasn't dropped an album, or Logic hasn't dropped an album. It's weird to me that people go, well, this is my experience, so they'll never get it. And like Dave said, in the black experience is this, and this. And he was like living in a barbershop saying that you're getting into much trouble. Like, that's fine. There's a lot of people that experience something like that, but a lot of people don't. So what are those people that's supposed to do that are African, that have African descent in them, but because they don't fit the normative that people see, they're this, or they're that? What are those conversations? What are those people supposed to listen to? People that they can't relate to? Because if they are, then what are we supposed to do? By what origin? So, because they can't relate to it and they don't like it, they're not included? That's just, it's weird to me to have this conversation, because I can't have, I mean, I can argue both sides and say, well, hip-hop is a genre massively created by this during times of hardship. That's fine. But I also can't go, because so-and-so doesn't fit these certain criteria, they can't be labeled the GOAT or the greatest of all time. But they can be qualified as a legend, but they can't be called the greatest of all time because the greatest of all time. But the list of the greatest of all time is still subjective. Right? Like, it's not written in fact, it's still subjective. So, I don't know. I feel like I'm just rambling, and that's not me. So I do want to cut this off, and I do want to say, I just want to know. I have a few questions, and I'm going to ask them on the Spotify's listeners, but you can listen to this everywhere. But that's a weird question I have. It's a conversation I want to have, but a conversation that I need to discuss. And I'm hopefully when I have these discussions throughout the year, some of these won't be planned yet, but when I have these discussions, we can genuinely have a genuine conversation where there's no bias or anything against it, and it's just a genuine conversation. So, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the King CJ Music Podcast. And if you're on Spotify, I just have a few questions. Can you just answer a few questions for me? But everyone else, I do hope you enjoy your day, and I hope this conversation opened a few people's eyes, and they didn't just kind of like dim them and go, "Hey, okay." Yeah, no, he rambled for 40 minutes. That's not the conversation I want to have, and I won't have that conversation. So I'll listen to the next episode. If this isn't your episode, we have other episodes. I would really encourage you to listen to. With that being said, hope you enjoy the rest of your day.